It wasn't just a double homicide. It was a slow-motion tragedy everyone saw coming, and no one stopped. What do you do when the killer isn't a stranger breaking in through the window, but someone who grew up down the hall? When the blood on your father's collar belongs to your brother? When the screams that haunt your dreams were made by the people who raised you, and silenced by someone with your same last name? Jake Reiner never wanted to speak. For years, he'd let the public think what they wanted about his famous father, his reclusive younger brother Nick, and the perfect Hollywood family the Reiners projected in magazines, on red carpets, and through decades of iconic film and television. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But something broke the silence. Something brutal. Something irreversible. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle, found stabbed to death in the foyer of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. A bloody trail leading to the guest house, where their troubled son Nick had been living for months, locked away from the world. And the one who found them, their youngest, Romy, just 27, trembling on the front steps, whispering to the 911 dispatcher that the person responsible was someone the family had been afraid of for years. Now, Jake Reiner is talking, and what he's saying has rocked Hollywood to its core. But let's go back, because this isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of a family divided, a son ignored, a brother overlooked, a sister traumatized, and a father so revered by the world that he refused to see the danger growing inside his own home. This is the story Jake Reiner has kept locked away, until now. And by the time we're done, you'll wonder why no one stopped this before it was too late. The Reiner family, America's Hollywood sweethearts. To understand the weight of Jake's silence and the shocking depth of his confession, you have to understand what the world thought the Reiners were. Rob Reiner, beloved director of When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me, and A Few Good Men. Michelle Singer Reiner, his elegant, media-shy wife, former photographer turned humanitarian. Their children, Jake, the upstanding broadcaster, Romy, the creative rising star, and Nick, the wild card, the baby, the one they didn't talk about. Publicly, they were tight-knit, classy, grounded, the rare Hollywood family who hadn't crumbled under the spotlight. But Jake paints a very different picture. Behind the closed doors of that Brentwood estate, there were whispers of broken doors, tearful dinners, sleepless nights, and one name always at the center of it all, Nick. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, unemployed, spiraling. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not living in the guest house, not back under their roof. But somehow he was. And now, two of his family members are dead. Why now? Why is Jake talking? Let's address the question everyone's been asking. Why did Jake Reiner, the quiet, clean-cut eldest son, suddenly come forward? Why now? The murders happened 3 weeks ago. There were whispers, rumors, tabloid chaos. But Jake said nothing. Until this morning, when he sat down with a national reporter and said just one sentence before the cameras started rolling. My brother destroyed our family. And we all let it happen. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just spoke, cold, clear, and with the weight of a man who'd been carrying a secret for years. What did Jake mean by that? What did they all let happen? That's what this story is about. And it's darker than anyone imagined. The dangerous history of Nick Reiner. Let's rewind. Nick Reiner wasn't always a suspect. At one point, he was a Hollywood kid with everything. His father, Rob, even dedicated an entire film, North, to him. But Nick fell hard. Substance abuse, arrests, rehab, rumors of aggression. By the time he was 25, he'd cycled through treatment centers across California and Arizona. Jake had distanced himself. Romy had blocked his number. Michelle? She kept hoping. And Rob Reiner believed in redemption. He believed in family. He believed his son would turn it around. So when Nick begged to move into the guest house behind their estate, Rob said yes. One more chance. But Jake, he warned them. He told his parents something was off. That Nick wasn't just struggling, he was unraveling. They didn't listen. Now Jake sits alone, haunted by the words he didn't scream louder. A crime scene straight out of a nightmare. The murders were as brutal as they were precise. Multiple stab wounds. No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. No intruder. And Nick? He was found in the guest house, covered in blood, allegedly muttering to himself. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just said one line. They always knew it would end this way. Let that sink in. A man allegedly kills his parents, then implies it was inevitable? That's not just shocking. That's a warning no one listened to. Romy's 911 call. He should be a suspect. And then there's Romy, the youngest, the artist, the one who walked into that house, saw her parents lifeless, and made the call that changed everything. There's someone dangerous, someone we were afraid of. He should be a suspect. She didn't say his name, but she didn't have to. Everyone already knew who she meant. Jake's silent guilt. Here's what's going to surprise you the most. Jake Reiner isn't just blaming Nick. He's blaming himself. I knew he was dangerous. I knew what he said about them. I knew what he was planning. But I told myself it was just words. Imagine carrying that guilt, knowing you could have done something, said something, forced your parents to act. And now? Now it's too late. This story isn't just about the Reiners. Maybe you're wondering why this matters. It's a celebrity family, a Hollywood tragedy. Why should we care? Because this story isn't just about the Reiners. It's about what happens when families ignore red flags, when fame protects dysfunction, when mental health is whispered about but never addressed, and when good people stay silent until it's too late. Jake Reiner's story is about all the things we pretend not to see. And what happens when pretending ends in blood? What's coming next will shock you. In the chapters that follow, you'll hear things that were never meant to be made public. Journal entries Jake never wanted read. Text messages Romy sent just days before the murders. A voicemail from Rob Reiner to Jake, one that's now evidence. And a final twist that might suggest Nick didn't act alone. What you're about to hear will make you question everything. Not just about this family, but about what we all choose to ignore. Because Jake Reiner's silence protected a lie. And now, that lie has destroyed everything. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What finally breaks a man who's been silent his entire life? Is it grief? Guilt? Or the moment you realize that staying quiet no longer protects anyone, especially yourself? Jake Reiner sat down knowing the moment the words left his mouth, there would be no going back. No family shield. No Hollywood buffer. No rewrites. No edits. Just the truth. Ugly. Raw. Unforgiving. And the first thing he said wasn't what anyone expected. I've been lying for years, Jake began. Not to the public. To myself. That single sentence sent a chill through everyone watching. Because Jake Reiner wasn't the dramatic one. He wasn't the rebel. He wasn't the troubled child. He was the stable one. The responsible one. The son Rob Reiner bragged about at dinners. The brother who kept things together when everything else was falling apart. So when he finally broke his silence, people leaned in. And what he revealed felt less like an interview and more like a confession. What do you say when the person who destroyed your family is your own brother? Jake didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He spoke slowly, choosing each word like it might explode if mishandled. I warned them, he said. More than once. That's when the room changed. Because warnings mean foresight. And foresight means responsibility. And responsibility means someone, somewhere, failed to act. Jake leaned forward. Nick didn't just snap. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't unpredictable. This was a long time coming. And suddenly, the story everyone thought they understood cracked wide open. Jake explained that for years, Nick had been living in a different reality. Not just emotionally, not just mentally, but morally. He described conversations that made his skin crawl, statements Nick would laugh off later, threats disguised as jokes, rage hidden behind charm. People think danger looks loud, Jake said. Sometimes it whispers. He paused. And sometimes, it lives in your parents' backyard. That line alone detonated across social media. But Jake wasn't done. He talked about the night his parents told him Nick was moving back onto the property. How his chest tightened. How he stared at the phone long after the call ended. How he knew, deep down, this wasn't mercy, it was denial. Dad believed love could fix anything, Jake said. He believed that if you never gave up on someone, they'd eventually find their way back. Jake exhaled. He was wrong. The interviewer asked the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say out loud. Did you think Nick was capable of killing them? Jake didn't answer immediately. He looked down, rubbed his hands together, swallowed hard. Yes, he finally said. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to suffocate the room. Yes. Not maybe. Not possibly. Yes. And then Jake added something even more disturbing. I didn't think it would be that night, he said. But I always knew it would be him. That sentence rewrote the entire narrative. Because now, this wasn't about a sudden act of violence. It was about inevitability. About a family watching a slow-moving train derail and convincing themselves it would somehow stop before impact. Jake described moments that haunted him. Family dinners where Nick would stare too long. Conversations where Nick spoke about their parents as obstacles. Late-night calls where Nick would rant about betrayal, inheritance, control. He hated them for loving him, Jake said quietly. And he hated me for seeing it. The interviewer pressed him, asked why he didn't go to the police. Why he didn't force an intervention. Why he didn't push harder. Jake's answer was devastating. Because every time I tried, he said, I was told I was overreacting. He explained that in their family, Nick was always the fragile one, the one you tiptoed around, the one whose anger was excused because it came with a diagnosis, the one whose threats were dismissed because he doesn't really mean it. Jake shook his head. But meaning something and doing something aren't the same, he said. Until they are. That's when Jake admitted something he'd never said publicly. There was a night, 2 years before the murders, when Nick told him directly that their parents would pay for what they'd done. Jake laughed it off at the time. I told myself he was venting, Jake said. I told myself he was hurting. He paused again. I was lying to myself. That admission cracked him open. Jake revealed he'd begun keeping notes. Private ones. Dates. Quotes. Behaviors. Not because he planned to expose Nick, but because he was scared he'd forget how bad it was if time softened the edges. I needed proof, he said. For myself. Proof that he wasn't imagining it. Proof that he wasn't cruel for wanting distance. Proof that something was deeply wrong. But here's the contradiction that tore him apart. Even with all that fear, Jake still loved his brother. And that love paralyzed him. How do you report someone you grew up with? Jake asked. How do you destroy your parents' hearts to protect them from a danger they refuse to see? That question hung in the air, unanswered. Jake talked about the last time he saw his father alive. It was casual. Too casual. A conversation about work. About a charity event. About nothing that mattered. I almost said something, Jake admitted. I almost told him everything. But he didn't. Because Rob Reiner smiled. Because Michelle laughed in the background. Because the house looked peaceful from the outside. And because Jake didn't want to be the son who ruined dinner with paranoia. That hesitation will haunt him forever. Then came the night of the murders. Jake was home, watching television, phone on silent, missed calls piling up. When he finally saw Romy's name flash across the screen, it was already too late. I knew before she spoke, Jake said. I just knew. He described the sound of her voice. The way it cracked. The way she couldn't finish sentences. She kept saying, he did it, Jake recalled. Over and over. Jake said the worst moment wasn't hearing his parents were dead. It was realizing his fear had been right. Because now, being right meant everyone lost. The interviewer asked if Jake had spoken to Nick since the arrest. Jake's answer was chilling. He asked me one question, Jake said. Just one. What did he ask? Jake swallowed. He asked if I was finally going to tell the truth. That revelation stunned viewers. Because it suggested Nick knew. Knew Jake had seen this coming. Knew Jake had kept quiet. Knew silence had protected him. Until it didn't. Jake didn't answer Nick's question. He hung up. And that's when Jake decided to speak publicly. Not for revenge. Not for sympathy. But because silence had already cost 2 lives. I won't protect him anymore, Jake said. I won't protect the lie that this was unavoidable. Jake looked directly into the camera at the end of the interview. If someone watching this is afraid of a family member, he said, listen to that fear. Don't wait for proof written in blood. And just when it seemed like Jake had said everything, he dropped one final bomb. There's something else, he said. Something I haven't told the police yet. The interviewer froze. What is it, she asked. Jake hesitated. Nick didn't act like this was his first time thinking about it, he said. He talked like it was the end of a plan. The room went silent. A plan? That single word changed everything. Because if Nick planned this, then someone might have known, helped, or ignored signs that went far beyond anger. Jake leaned back. And there's one night, he said slowly, that no one's asking about yet. But they will. Because what happened that night may explain everything. And when it comes out, it could change this case forever. But what came next would tear the Reiner family even further apart and expose secrets no one was ready to face. What happens when love becomes denial, and denial becomes deadly? From the outside, the Reiners looked perfect. Rob Reiner, the Hollywood legend, the man behind films that shaped generations, a father figure to millions on screen, a progressive voice off screen, a man with a legacy most dream about. Michelle Reiner, his elegant, enigmatic wife, always poised, always supportive, the woman who'd stood by his side for decades, far from the spotlight, but always present. And their children? Well, that's where the cracks started showing, long before anyone noticed. Because inside the walls of that Brentwood mansion was a very different family. And slowly, those cracks became fractures. The perfect illusion. Let's rewind. Imagine the family portrait. Rob, in his signature warm smile. Michelle, gracious as ever. Jake, composed. Romy, quirky and bright. Nick, often in the back, looking either too serious or too tired. Most assume Nick was just shy, maybe artistic, maybe overwhelmed by the weight of a famous last name. But what if he wasn't just overwhelmed? What if he was imploding quietly? Jake Reiner remembers the shift. It didn't come overnight. It came in whispers. Nick stopped eating meals with the family. Then he stopped returning texts. Then came the missed birthdays, the darkened rooms, the outbursts. By the time Nick was in his early 20s, he wasn't just distant, he was volatile. And yet, Rob kept calling it a phase. The two Nicks. There were two versions of Nick Reiner. To his friends, when he had them, he was clever, sardonic, painfully smart. He could quote Tolstoy and Tarantino in the same sentence. He wrote screenplays no one read, but everyone admired. But to his family, he was a storm always one breath away from breaking. One Thanksgiving, Jake recalled, Nick slammed a wine glass into the wall over a political disagreement. Romy burst into tears. Michelle tried to smooth it over. Rob stayed quiet. It's just stress, he said. But the silence afterward spoke volumes. And Jake? He started keeping his distance. It wasn't just that he was angry, Jake would later admit. It was that we were walking on eggshells and calling it love. Michelle's quiet panic. Michelle saw it too. But her love for Nick ran deep, perhaps too deep. Some say she saw herself in him. Others say she thought if she could just reach him, mother to son, she could pull him back. She would go into the guest house at night. Romy reportedly told a close friend. She'd sit with him for hours. Sometimes I'd hear them arguing. Other times, it was just silence. But what no one knew was that Michelle had begun journaling. She kept a notebook hidden behind the linen closet in the master bedroom. It was filled with notes, fragments of conversations with Nick. Words like, he says he hears Dad's voice when no one's home. He told me someone is trying to poison him. He cried today. I held him. I don't think he even knew it was me. Some entries ended with single phrases. I'm scared. He's slipping. How did we get here? But she never showed it to Rob. Not once. Why? Maybe she was protecting him. Maybe she thought it would pass. Or maybe, deep down, she knew confronting Rob meant admitting that their family was no longer the one they'd built for the cameras. And once that mask slips, there's no putting it back on. Jake's quiet exit. Jake, meanwhile, had long removed himself from the family bubble. By his late 20s, he'd moved across town, created a life in media. Clean, structured, distant. Jake lived in emotional exile, one family friend remarked. He loved them, but from a safe distance. He didn't bring friends to family dinners. He rarely stayed long. He always had an early morning or a work thing. But his avoidance wasn't cold. It was fear, because Jake had seen Nick at his worst, and he didn't trust him. There was a Christmas Eve incident that no one in the family ever discussed publicly. Nick reportedly locked himself in the bathroom for hours after an argument with Rob. When he emerged, he was bleeding from his knuckles and ranting about how everyone's against me. Jake tried to calm him. Nick shoved him hard. Jake didn't go back the next day. He never returned for another Reiner holiday. And yet, every year, he sent a card. Every year, he called Romy. Because distance didn't mean indifference. It meant survival. Romy, the watcher. Romy Reiner, youngest of the three. Just 27. Creative, sharp, always posting art and quirky insights online. But behind that brightness was a girl watching her family fall apart in slow motion. She was the one who still lived close to their parents. The one who came over for dinner. The one who saw Nick more than the others. And she was the one who found the bodies. Can you imagine that? Walking into your childhood home. The smell of iron in the air. Silence, so loud it roars. And then, your mother, your father, still, gone. And your brother, just steps away. That moment changed Romy forever. But it didn't start that night. It started months before, when she began keeping voice notes on her phone. In one of them, dated 6 weeks before the murders, she whispers, "I don't think he's okay. He looks at me like he doesn't recognize me." In another, he said something about starting over. I asked what he meant. He just smiled. Romy saw it coming. She felt it. But like Jake, she didn't know how to sound the alarm. Because what do you do when the danger is someone you once held as a baby? The guest house, Nick's kingdom. The guest house behind the Brentwood estate had become Nick's domain. Locked doors, covered windows, cameras he installed himself. He had everything. A private kitchen, bathroom, workspace. He came and went when he pleased. Rarely joined the main house for meals. Rarely spoke unless spoken to. And when he did, it was usually to Rob. Their conversations had become circular, strange. He'd talk about betrayal, Jake said. How Dad never let him succeed. How Romy was Mom's favorite. How I was the liar. Rob, ever the optimist, kept trying to connect. He gave Nick scripts. Offered to introduce him to producers. Even pitched co-writing a project. Nick refused. Or worse. He mocked it. He thought Dad was a sellout, Jake revealed. Said he made movies that made people feel good while the world burned. The bitterness ran deep. And yet, Rob never cut him off. Because he was still his son. And because Rob believed everyone deserves redemption. But not everyone wants it. The boiling point. Everything came to a head 1 week before the murders. There was a family dinner. Rare these days. Jake wasn't there. Romy was. Michelle cooked. Rob tried to keep the conversation light. Nick barely touched his food. According to Romy, at some point, Nick stood up and said, "You're all liars. You smile and act like we're a family, but we haven't been one in years." Rob asked him to calm down. Nick laughed. "You'll all see soon." He walked out. Rob sighed. Michelle followed him, trying to talk. Romy cleaned up. No one spoke about it afterward. No one thought it would be the last time. The unraveling. 5 days later, Rob canceled a meeting. Unusual. 2 days later, Michelle didn't answer a text from her sister. Even more unusual. And then, nothing. No responses. No updates. Silence. Until Romy showed up that Sunday morning, bags under her eyes, coffee in hand, expecting brunch. Instead, she found blood, a knife, and a silence that screamed. She called 911. Then Jake. Then collapsed. The family was no longer a family. A family in freefall. The days that followed felt like a dream. The news broke. Hollywood mourned. Fans posted clips of Rob's best scenes. Colleagues shared memories. But behind the headlines, behind the tributes, one question echoed. How did it come to this? And that question brought the spotlight back to Jake. Because the truth is, this wasn't random. This was years in the making. A family too afraid to confront itself. Too loving to draw the line. Too late to stop what was already happening. And Jake knew that. Which is why, when he looked into the camera and said, "We all let this happen," it wasn't a soundbite. It was a verdict. But what Jake didn't reveal yet, what he was saving, was the secret he'd uncovered in his father's study after the murders. A file. A letter. A conversation that might prove Rob Reiner knew more than he ever admitted. And if that's true, then the next chapter isn't just about Nick. It's about who tried to protect him and what it cost. What happens when the threat you fear most is already living on your property, and no one's brave enough to open the door? That's the question Jake Reiner asked himself for years. Because the guest house in Brentwood wasn't just a small structure tucked away from the main home. It wasn't a casual dwelling for guests or a retreat for creative work. It was a containment zone, a pressure cooker, and inside was someone who had, slowly and methodically, begun to detach from reality. And from the family who put him there. Nick Reiner wasn't just staying in the guest house. He was preparing. For what? Jake would later call it the slow war, a psychological and emotional unraveling that escalated with each month Nick spent isolated behind those locked doors. And when it finally exploded, it wasn't sudden. It was scripted. The setup. Why was Nick even there? Let's start with the biggest question people ask. Why was a 32-year-old man with a documented history of addiction, mental health instability, and reported violent outbursts living just steps away from 2 aging parents? one of whom had just had knee surgery. The answer is simple. Rob Reiner believed in second chances. Always had. Always would. Jake revealed during his second public interview that the arrangement was never meant to be permanent. Nick had just left a 45-day inpatient treatment center in Malibu. The plan was for him to get back on his feet and move into transitional housing in Echo Park. But something happened. Nick refused to leave. He insisted he wasn't ready. Michelle, predictably, caved first. Rob agreed to a few weeks in the guest house. A few weeks turned into months. And then, Nick locked the doors. He bought blackout curtains, installed security cameras, changed the locks, and no one stopped him. Because every time Rob tried to talk about boundaries, Michelle stepped in. "Don't push him," she'd whisper. "He's fragile." But fragility, Jake would later argue, can be a mask for manipulation. Inside the guest house, we may never know everything that happened behind that door. But according to investigators, what they found inside post-murders painted a disturbing picture of dissent. The walls were covered with taped pages, journal entries, sketches, printed out emails, some with red circles and arrows drawn in thick Sharpie. The themes: betrayal, abandonment, control. Nick's writings repeated the same phrases over and over. "They lied to me. They replaced me. He stole my life." Who was he? Jake. Several entries specifically named Jake Reiner. "He thinks he's better than me. He took what was mine. They always loved him more." One particularly haunting page read, "Dad made movies about good men. But he wasn't one. He was a liar. They all are. And liars get what they deserve. If that doesn't chill you, nothing will." Neighbors noticed and were ignored. The Brentwood estate was private, but not invisible. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of Nick pacing the guest house yard late at night, sometimes shirtless, sometimes muttering. One neighbor recalled seeing him standing in the rain for hours. "I thought he was meditating," she said. "Now? I don't know." Others heard shouting at odd hours. One local handyman reported hearing glass shattering and screaming during a routine sprinkler inspection. When he asked Michelle about it the next day, she waved it off. "Nick's working on something creative," she said. That was the default explanation. Nick wasn't unstable. He was intense. Not erratic, expressive. Not dangerous, just in pain. And maybe that's true. But pain doesn't excuse murder. And looking back, Jake says the signs weren't just there, they were screaming. Jake's visit to the guest house. There was one visit, one last attempt at connection. Jake drove over. Parked on the side street. Walked through the back gate. He hadn't seen Nick face-to-face in nearly 8 months. He brought coffee, not as a peace offering, but as a test, to see if his brother could handle something as simple as a casual conversation. What he found shook him. Nick was gaunt, pale, unshaven. He barely spoke. Instead, he flipped through a notebook, mumbling about a plan and timing and getting it back. Jake tried to redirect the conversation, asked how he was sleeping. "Eating. Writing." Nick laughed. "You think I'm crazy," he said. "But I'm the only one who's awake." Jake didn't know how to respond. And then, Nick dropped something terrifying. "They think they can trap me in this little box and forget me. But this house, this family, it'll remember me." Jake left 20 minutes later. He didn't tell his parents about what Nick said, because by then, he felt like a broken record. "They won't listen," Jake told a close friend. "And if they do, they'll forgive him." Again, the warning signs multiply. After that visit, things escalated. Romy called Jake in tears. Said Nick had cornered her in the kitchen one afternoon and accused her of taking Mom away. He was shaking. His pupils were dilated. His breath reeked of something chemical. She ran, locked herself in the bathroom, called her therapist the next day. But not the police. Because calling the police on your brother feels like betrayal, even when you're scared. Jake begged Romy to talk to their parents. She refused. "They'll just make excuses," she said. And she wasn't wrong. Rob and Michelle, according to Jake, were deep in denial. They believed Nick was improving. He was journaling. He was sober. He was creative again. They called it progress. Jake called it camouflage. The night Michelle went alone. One night, just a week before the murders, Michelle made the mistake that might have sealed her fate. She went to the guest house alone. We don't know why. No one does. Romy had left for a shoot. Jake was out of town. But the cameras caught her, 9:12 p.m., walking across the patio. She never mentioned what was said. But the next morning, House staff noticed something strange. Michelle was quiet, pale. She canceled a meeting, told Romy not to come by. She didn't eat much that day, and later that night, she wrote in her journal, "He looked at me like I was a stranger." The knife that was never recovered. Among the forensics recovered was the murder weapon, or rather, what was supposed to be the murder weapon. A butcher knife, wiped and placed in the sink. But there's a problem. Autopsy results revealed 2 separate blade patterns, and only one knife was found, which means there might have been another weapon. Where is it? And more importantly, who moved it? Jake believes someone helped Nick, intentionally or not. Maybe someone outside the family. Maybe someone inside. But if there was a second weapon, that means the scene was tampered with. And that opens the door to something far more sinister. Because if Nick wasn't working alone, then this story isn't just about a son turning on his parents. It's about a conspiracy to protect him. Jake's theory. Jake has a theory. He hasn't shared it publicly. Not all of it. But what he has revealed suggests he believes someone in the family, or close to it, knew what Nick was planning. And they said nothing. Maybe they thought he wouldn't go through with it. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they thought silence would stop the spiral. But it didn't. It fed it. And Jake says he has proof, texts, emails, a voice recording he hasn't released. Why hasn't he handed it over? Because, in his words, if I'm right, then I wasn't the only one who failed my parents. The guest house is now empty, but the questions are just beginning. Today, the guest house sits vacant. The windows still boarded. The lights still off. A crime scene sealed by yellow tape and memory. But that little building holds answers. Answers to what Nick was really planning. What his family ignored. And what someone might have helped cover up. Jake wants it investigated. Romy refuses to go near it. And Nick? He hasn't said a word since his arrest. But next week, at the preliminary hearing, a piece of surveillance footage is expected to be introduced. One that shows a shadow leaving the guest house 20 minutes before the police arrived. It doesn't match Nick's frame. It doesn't match Romy. It doesn't match Jake. So who was it? And more importantly, what were they carrying? What comes next could unravel everything. Because if that shadow is who Jake thinks it is, then this murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cover-up. What does it sound like when your entire world shatters, but your mouth won't make a sound? Romy Reiner had always been the quiet one. Not invisible. No, never that. But quiet in a way that made people lean in. She was the artist of the family. The observer. The one who didn't interrupt. Didn't shout. Didn't accuse. Until that Sunday morning. Until she stepped through the front door of her parents' Brentwood mansion and slipped on blood. Until she screamed. And then whispered the words that cracked the whole story open. There's someone dangerous in the house, and it's someone we know. The 911 operator asked her to repeat it. She didn't. She couldn't. Because that kind of terror doesn't come out clean. It comes out fractured, shaking, coated. Romy Reiner wasn't just the daughter who found the bodies. She was the canary in the coal mine. And she'd been singing quietly for months. No one had been listening. The day it happened. Let's start there. Because everything that followed, Jake's confession, the public fallout, the trial, it all begins with one girl walking into a nightmare she never asked for. It was a Sunday. Bright skies. No wind. Brentwood was quiet. Romy was expected for brunch. Michelle had texted her the night before. 10:30 sharp. We're making your favorite. She arrived late. She always did. 10:52 a.m. The gate code hadn't changed. The front door was unlocked. That was the first red flag. The Reiners always locked their front door. Always. Romy stepped inside and smelled it. Not the scent of baking or fresh coffee. Iron. Heavy. Thick. Blood has a smell you never forget. She looked down. Her white sneakers were no longer white. She froze. Then, movement. From the hallway. She wasn't alone. She called out, "Mom." No answer. She moved forward. Slowly. One hand shaking. The other still gripping her phone. She turned the corner. And saw them. Rob was collapsed near the stairs. Michelle not far. Both unrecognizable. Still. She dropped the phone. Then picked it up again. Then dropped it again. The call finally connected. 911. What's your emergency? And then Romy whispered something she'd written in her journal just weeks before. It happened. He did it. I know it. The journal no one knew about. The police didn't find Romy's journal at first. She didn't offer it up. Not because she was hiding something, but because trauma makes you forget where the truth is stored. It was only days later, when Jake came to check on her, that he noticed it. A red sketchbook, frayed corners, stuffed into her bookcase, wedged between a stack of psychology books and a dead iPad. Jake opened it and froze. The entries began 3 months before the murders. They weren't structured. They weren't dated. Just thoughts. Scraps. Panic in ink. He watches me when I walk to the kitchen. I can't breathe when he's in the same room. Last night he said, everything will reset soon. Jake brought it to the police the next morning. It was entered into evidence within hours. And it changed everything. Because now, it wasn't just Jake saying he was afraid of Nick. Now there was Romy. And her fear was written down before the killings. The moment, everything shifted. What no one outside the family knew at the time was that Romy had already been planning to confront her parents about Nick. She had a therapy appointment scheduled for Monday. She told her therapist she was going to ask Rob to remove Nick from the guest house. That it wasn't safe anymore. That she was done pretending. But she never got the chance. Because Sunday happened first. And everything she'd planned to say turned into the sound of sirens. The audio, Romy's 911 call. The call has not been publicly released in full, but a transcript was leaked by a Brentwood officer, and what it reveals is heartbreaking. Romy's voice is barely audible at first. Shaky, fast, breathing too heavy to form words. But then she says, I need help. They're not breathing. My parents. My dad, he's on the floor. My mom. Her eyes are open, but she's not blinking. The operator tries to keep her calm. Then comes the question, do you know who may have done this? And Romy whispers, he lives in the back house. Please, you need to come now. The operator asks for clarification. Is he still there? Romy's answer, I think so. I think he's waiting. That line shook the investigation, because it implied something cold, calculated, premeditated, and worst of all, familiar. Romy's emotional collapse. In the days after the murder, Romy didn't speak publicly. Not to the media. Not on social media. Not even to Jake. Not really. She curled into herself. Refused to eat. Slept in 20-minute stretches. She kept seeing them. Kept replaying the last few seconds before she entered the house. If she had arrived earlier. If she hadn't been late. If she had screamed louder the week before. This is how survivors' guilt festers. Quietly. Relentlessly. The night before, a missed signal. What's perhaps most devastating is what Romy texted a friend the night before the murders. It was 9:41 p.m. She wrote, I think something's off. Mom's acting weird. Dad keeps looking out the window. I don't know why, but I feel like something's going to happen. Her friend never responded. The next message Romy sent wasn't a message. It was a missed call. At 10:09 a.m., while she was standing over her parents' bodies. The haunting detail, Romy's drawing. 1 week after the funerals, Romy handed over a sketch to investigators. She had drawn it in therapy. It showed the family home, the front lawn, the trees, and in the back, the guest house. But it wasn't just architecture. Each figure in the drawing was labeled. Rob and Michelle, smiling. Jake, far away, near the gate. Romy, on the steps. Nick, standing in the guest house window, with fire in his eyes. The therapist asked what the fire meant. Romy's answer? It's what I think he saw when he looked at us. That sketch is now part of the case file. A piece of artistic testimony. And an eerie preview of the storm that was already coming. The revelation no one expected. But here's where everything turned. Because 2 days before the chapter closed on Romy's witness statement, she remembered something else. A conversation she overheard between Rob and Michelle. It was 2 nights before their deaths. They were in the living room. Romy was upstairs. She wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally, but she heard it. Her father's voice. He's not getting better, Michelle. We need to make a decision. And her mother's reply? Let's just get through Sunday. What did that mean? What decision? Was Rob preparing to remove Nick? Was Sunday supposed to be a turning point? Or did Nick overhear that same conversation? Jake thinks it was the trigger. That somehow, Nick heard that his safety net was being pulled away. And he acted before they could. The last message. Romy didn't share this until much later, weeks after the media storm died down. But at 2:11 a.m. on the morning of the murders, she received a message from Nick. Just one sentence. Enjoy brunch. That's it. No emoji. No context. Just that. Chilling. Mocking. Premeditated. She didn't see it until after the fact. Didn't even remember it was there. Her phone had slid under the passenger seat of her car. She found it 2 days after the funeral. And when she opened it, her hands went cold. That message is now evidence. A digital ghost of what was to come. What Romy saw in the backyard. Here's what's never been reported until now. When Romy called 911, she said she thought someone was still in the house. But security footage tells a different story. Just before the police arrived, Romy walked outside. She was pacing. She stopped suddenly, looked toward the guest house, and backed away. Investigators asked what she saw. Romy hesitated, and then said something that changed everything. It wasn't Nick. It was someone else. They asked who. She didn't know. A figure, shorter than Nick, wearing a hoodie, carrying something. She said they slipped between the hedges and disappeared into the alley. That footage is grainy, blurry, nearly useless, but it's enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, Nick Reiner wasn't alone. Because what comes next is going to change this case entirely. Someone helped him. Someone hid the second weapon. Someone wanted the Reiners silenced. And Romy? She saw them. She just doesn't know it yet. When police entered the Reiner estate, they expected a scene of chaos. What they found instead looked almost staged. It didn't make sense. 2 bodies, multiple stab wounds, blood spatter trailing across the tile. But no broken glass. No forced entry. No struggle. Rob and Michelle Reiner, brutally killed in their own home, hadn't even tried to run. Why? That's the question that's haunted investigators since the very beginning. Because the house wasn't ransacked. The safe hadn't been touched. Their wallets, phones, jewelry, everything was still there. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was something far colder. A message, a statement, an execution. And once detectives began walking through the Brentwood estate, it became clear. Whoever did this knew the layout, knew the victims, and wanted them to feel something in those final moments. But what? Fear? Betrayal? Regret? Let's step into the house, room by room, and examine what really happened inside the Reiner home that night. Because the details don't just point to Nick. They raise even darker questions. The first room, the foyer. This is where Rob Reiner's body was found. Face down, head turned sharply to the side. Multiple stab wounds, 8 total. 5 in the back, 3 in the chest. But no defensive wounds on his hands. Which means he didn't see it coming, or he didn't fight back. And that's the first red flag. Rob Reiner was 78, yes, but he wasn't weak. Still active, still sharp. If someone came at him with a knife, he would have resisted. Unless he knew them, trusted them, didn't believe they'd actually do it. That changes everything. Now we're not just talking about murder. We're talking about a betrayal carried out at close range. And then there's the strangest part. His glasses were neatly folded, sitting on the foyer table, as if he'd removed them just before the attack. Or worse, as if someone else placed them there after. The second room, the kitchen. This is where police believe Michelle was first attacked. Unlike Rob, she had defensive wounds, deep slices on her forearms and palms. She fought. Blood found near the marble kitchen island suggests she tried to crawl away after the first wound. One trail of smears leads to the pantry. That's where her body was eventually found, slumped, head resting against a box of pasta. She died slowly, not instantly. And according to the autopsy, she was stabbed after Rob, which means she might have witnessed his murder before her own. But here's what chills the blood. A bottle of wine had been opened. 2 glasses poured. One had lipstick. One didn't. Which begs the question, was she having a drink with her killer? And if so, was it Nick? Or was someone else there? The sink knife. And the missing one. At first, it seemed open and shut. There was a large chef's knife in the sink. Bloodied. Fingerprints smudged. It matched some of the wounds. But not all. The coroner noted at least 2 distinct blade types. One wide, one thin. Only one knife was recovered. The other? Gone. No trail. No blood drops leading out of the house. No prints. No case. Just gone. Like someone took it. Intentionally. Which means either Nick had the clarity to remove a weapon post-murder, or someone else helped clean up the scene. And if that's true, then this wasn't a solo act. The guest bathroom, a bloody clue. Now this is where things get strange. Police found blood in the downstairs guest bathroom. Not a lot. Just a smear on the edge of the porcelain sink. It didn't match the spatter in the kitchen or foyer, which suggests someone washed their hands. The blood was tested. It came back as belonging to neither Rob nor Michelle. You read that correctly. It was a third profile. DNA analysts are now working to identify it. But as of now, it doesn't match Jake. Doesn't match Romy. Doesn't match anyone in the family. So who does it belong to? And what were they doing in the bathroom? Washing up, while two bodies lay cooling in the other room. That single clue flipped this case inside out. Because if Nick was alone, who the hell bled in that sink? Security footage, or lack thereof. Another mystery? The security system. Rob Reiner's estate had state-of-the-art surveillance. Interior and exterior cameras. Motion sensors. Backup battery packs. But guess what? The night of the murder, the hard drive was wiped. Someone accessed the security system at 3:12 a.m. Deleted everything. Professionally. IT experts told police it wasn't a smash-and-grab job. The files were scrubbed clean, rewritten, reformatted, like someone who knew the system intimately, or someone who had help from someone who did. So now we're talking about a hidden weapon, a third blood type, and erased footage. That's no crime of passion. That's surgical. The note that shouldn't exist. One of the most disturbing findings? A note found in Rob's desk drawer, dated 2 days before the murder. Written by Rob. It read, "If anything happens to Michelle or me, check the guest house." It wasn't addressed to anyone, just folded neatly, left between scripts and receipts. Jake discovered it, not the police. He turned it over immediately, and the handwriting was verified as Rob's, which means Rob was afraid. He saw the signs. He just didn't act fast enough. And that note? It wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. Forensics report, a twist. Then came the forensics bombshell. A pair of footprints, bloody, size 9.5, leading from the foyer toward the back patio. They weren't Nick's. Nick wears a 12. Romy wears a 7. Jake wears an 11. So who left them? And why were they heading out, not in? And this gets even creepier. The prints stop near the garden hedge and pick up again in the alley behind the guest house, as if someone changed shoes or had help escaping. Either way, someone else was there. And whoever they were, they walked away. Clean. Nick's arrest, his chilling calm. When police reached the guest house, they expected a barricade situation. Nick had a history of volatile behavior. Instead, they found him sitting on the couch. Lights off. Music playing, classical. Tchaikovsky. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't resist. He just looked up and said, "Took you long enough." Creepy? That's an understatement. He was covered in blood, but calm. No weapon in sight. Just him. A broken plate on the floor. And an old family photo. Rob, Michelle, Jake, Romy, and Nick. The photo had been slashed with a knife. And Nick? He was holding the corner with his own face torn off. The question everyone's asking. So now we're left with a puzzle. Nick had motive. Opportunity. A long history of rage and resentment. But the evidence doesn't fully support him acting alone. Too many gaps. Too many anomalies. A missing weapon. Unknown DNA. Wiped security. Footprints that don't belong. Could he have done all that by himself? Jake doesn't think so. Neither does Romy. And the detectives? They're keeping their mouths shut. Because behind the scenes, they're investigating someone else. A person of interest. Someone close to the family. Someone Nick trusted. And someone who might be the key to unlocking the real story. Because what comes next isn't just about forensic evidence. It's about a hidden relationship and the secret that Rob and Michelle Reiner may have died protecting. And once it's revealed, the entire case may explode. What would you write down if you thought your own brother was capable of murder, but no one believed you? Jake Reiner never meant for anyone to read his journal. It wasn't a memoir. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't meant to explain things, just to survive them. Because when words fail you in conversation, sometimes the only thing left is the page. And Jake had a lot to say about Nick. Most of it too painful to share out loud. Too complicated. Too damning. So he wrote. Not every day. Not like clockwork. But when the pressure got too much, he opened a leather-bound notebook and let the truth out. The pages became his sanctuary. But now, they've become something else. Evidence. And what they reveal paints a chilling portrait of a man who saw the storm coming and still couldn't stop it. Discovery of the journal. The journal came to light days after Rob and Michelle's funeral. Jake had returned to his own apartment for the first time since the murders. Alone. Silent. Exhausted. He opened a drawer in his nightstand to grab a phone charger and there it was. Worn edges, bent spine, a few loose receipts tucked between pages. He hadn't written in it since the week before the killings. And the last entry scared him, because it read, "He's spiraling again. I can feel it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. I keep having this dream that I'm too late." Jake turned it over to the police the next morning. And what investigators found inside could shift the entire trajectory of this case. The early entries, frustration and hope. The first few entries weren't alarming. In fact, they were hopeful. Jake wrote about wanting to reconnect with Nick, about a time they used to go hiking together, how Nick would quote film lines on the trails, how, deep down, Jake still believed his brother could return to that version of himself. "He's smart, funny when he wants to be. I just think he's in pain. And we've never known how to handle pain in this family." But slowly, the tone shifts. I saw his eyes change. There's one entry, dated roughly 18 months before the murders. Jake had stopped by the family home to visit Rob. Nick was there, uninvited. They had lunch in the backyard. It was quiet, until Nick started talking about legacies. He said things like, "Dad built his name off fake heroes. Everyone sees a director. I see a narcissist. None of this was earned." Jake asked him to stop. Nick turned, and Jake wrote, "There was a look in his eyes I can't explain. Like he wasn't seeing me. Like he was scanning me for weakness." That entry ended with a sentence circled 3 times. "He's not just angry. He's somewhere else." The event no one knew about. Perhaps the most damning entry occurred 3 months before the murders. Jake described an incident that was never reported to the police. Nick had shown up at Jake's workplace, unannounced. It was a Friday afternoon. Nick was agitated, his eyes bloodshot. He reeked of cigarettes and something else. Jake couldn't identify it. He ranted for 15 minutes about being erased. He said, "They're trying to write me out. Romy gets all the sympathy. You get all the pride. I get silence." Jake tried to calm him down, offered to get coffee. Nick leaned in and whispered, "If I go out, I'm taking someone with me." Jake froze. He never told anyone, not even Rob. Because how do you report your brother for something he might mean metaphorically? That entry ends with 2 words in bold ink. "I'm scared. Warnings ignored." There are 5 separate entries where Jake mentions trying to warn his parents. Each time, the result was the same. Rob would nod, thank him, then dismiss it. Michelle would smile gently and say, "He's improving, Jake. We have to believe in him." In one entry, Jake recounts a phone call with Romy. She was crying. "He's talking to himself again. And last night, he locked me out of the kitchen and said, 'The house picks its favorites.'" What does that even mean? Jake encouraged her to leave. She didn't. She stayed. Because family is complicated. And leaving feels like betrayal. The last line of that entry? "I think we're all going to regret this." The final pages. The last entries are chilling. They read less like journaling and more like a warning written to no one in particular. Here are some excerpts. "I keep thinking I should go back over there. One more visit. Try again. But every time I picture walking into that guest house, I feel like I'm walking into a trap. Dad keeps saying next week we'll talk to him. But next week keeps getting further away. Last night, I dreamed I was walking through the house, and there was blood everywhere. And Nick was standing at the window, smiling like he was proud of something. Then, finally, I don't think there's time left. But if I say that out loud, they'll think I'm dramatic. So I'll just say it here. If something happens, I tried." That line, "If something happens, I tried," has been quoted in every major outlet since. Because it doesn't just express fear. It captures a brother's paralysis. The terrible balance between love and alarm. Jake saw the train coming, but he didn't know how to stop it. Investigators react. When the journal was reviewed by the detectives, it was flagged as potential pre-incident intelligence. But since Jake had never filed a formal complaint, it became what they call non-actionable awareness. In other words, he knew something was wrong, but there was no protocol to stop it. That failure now haunts the department too, because it raises a serious question. How many family tragedies could be prevented if fear alone were enough to trigger action? Jake's regret. In his most recent interview, Jake spoke about the journal with quiet devastation. "I didn't write it to protect myself. I wrote it because I felt like no one else was watching," he said. When asked why he never took it to the police, his voice cracked. "Because then it's real. And I wasn't ready for it to be real." That contradiction, that tension between knowing and denying, is what defines this entire story. It wasn't just that Jake feared Nick. It's that he loved him too. And that love is what silenced him. Until it was too late. The hidden envelope. But there's one more twist. At the very back of the journal, inside a pocket most notebooks include for receipts or notes, there was an envelope. Unlabeled, unsealed, but folded tightly. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Typed. Dated 7 days before the murders. A printout of an email from Nick to an unknown recipient. It read, "They think I'll never do it. That I'm weak. But I've been planning this for longer than they know. When it's over, they'll finally understand who I am. I'm not a joke. I'm the truth." There was no name on the other end. No reply. No thread. But the email address it was sent from? An encrypted alias tied to an IP in the Brentwood area. Jake had printed it out after seeing it pop up in his inbox as a mysterious forward. He never figured out who sent it to him. But he saved it anyway. Instinctively. That instinct might just prove that Nick didn't plan this alone. That someone out there was encouraging him. What comes next? The journal has now been entered as evidence. It may be used during the trial. But more importantly, it's opened a new line of inquiry. Because if Nick was corresponding with someone who shared his hatred, his delusions, his rage, then this isn't just a family tragedy. It's a network. And what Jake wrote may be the breadcrumb trail that leads directly to them. Because the truth isn't just on the surface. It's buried in ink, in grief, and in the words no one was supposed to read. But what comes next? We'll take those words and turn them into a courtroom firestorm. What happens when someone spirals in plain sight and an entire industry looks the other way? That's not just a rhetorical question. It's the crux of the tragedy that unfolded inside the Reiner household. Because Nick Reiner didn't unravel in secret. He didn't hide behind closed doors in a back alley or an unknown town. He melted down under the glow of Hollywood, surrounded by agents, producers, industry veterans, people who had known him since he was a kid on his father's movie sets, people who saw the shift, heard the stories, got the calls, and said nothing. Why? Because his last name was Reiner. Because the industry protects its own, even when that protection becomes a weapon. Nick Reiner, Hollywood royalty. Let's be clear. Nick wasn't just any celebrity kid. He was Hollywood legacy. His father? One of the most respected directors in the industry. His grandfather? Carl Reiner, comedy royalty. From the moment Nick could walk, he was on sets. By age 9, he'd sat in on film edits. By 13, he was being courted by agents. By 15, he was already labeled the next creative genius. But behind the scenes, he was unraveling. Substance abuse began in his teens. By 19, he'd been in and out of rehab more than once. By 22, he'd dropped out of college, burned through trust fund cash, and was living off and on in the guest house. And yet, no one pulled him out of the industry pipeline. Because Hollywood doesn't cut off potential. Especially not when it's wrapped in legacy. The first warning signs. There was an incident, quietly buried, in 2019. Nick reportedly showed up drunk to a table read for a project backed by a major streaming platform. He wasn't cast, wasn't even hired. Just there, claiming to have creative authority. When asked to leave, he reportedly exploded. You don't tell a Reiner what to do. Security escorted him out. The story never made the trades. Because someone made a call. Whispers say it was Rob himself, trying to protect his son. And who could blame him? But that protection came at a cost. Because each time Nick faced consequences, someone erased them. A slap on the wrist here. A quiet settlement there. He's just struggling, explanation everywhere. The inner circle, what they knew. Multiple sources, studio insiders, publicists, even former assistants, have since come forward anonymously. They say they knew Nick was dangerous. Not in the tabloid way. In the real way. The kind that makes you check the locks twice when he's nearby. Here's what they reported. He carried a knife in his backpack for protection. He once stormed out of a meeting screaming about being watched. He told one junior producer, "The next time you see me, you'll wish you hadn't." And yet, nothing was done. Why? Because doing something meant risking a headline. Risking a relationship with Rob. Risking reputation. And in Hollywood, reputation is currency. Nick's volatility wasn't seen as a liability. It was chalked up as artistic temperament. The dangerous rebranding. In 2021, there was a quiet attempt to rehabilitate Nick's image. A major talent agency began circulating a script he'd written. They pitched it as raw, personal, darkly beautiful. The logline: a misunderstood son returns to his childhood home and confronts a family secret that threatens to destroy them all. Sound familiar? It was fiction, but too close to the truth. Jake later confirmed that script was essentially Nick's diary. One exec reportedly called it genius. Another said, he's channeling his trauma. What they didn't say? He needs help. Instead,